Our next speaker, Dr. Kenneth Burnham, is a professor emeritus in the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at CSU. He had a very long career working with David. He has a BS in biology from Portland State. He then headed up to Oregon State, where he earned a statistics degree, a master's, and a PhD. His work on his PhD sort of caught the eye of David in capture-recapture. He spent some time working at the U.S. Forest Service and then worked for about 10 years with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, including 8 years in Fort Collins. He then worked for the USDA in Raleigh, North Carolina, before his final position of 21 years here at Colorado State University as an assistant unit leader in the Colorado Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Unit and a faculty in the department. He retired in 2008. His research interests over his career have included statistical inference methods for ecological wildlife and fishery studies and database modeling of biological process, including model selection and assessing model uncertainty. His work has included lots of study design, especially for estimation of population abundance and population dynamics parameters. Along the way, a few of his honors were being named an American Statistical Society Fellow. Only a few are selected. He was promoted to a USGS Senior Scientist, the highest level that a federal research scientist can achieve. And he's also an Aldo Leopold Award winner, the highest honor of the Wildlife Society. There's quite a few of those people in this audience right now, as well as David Anderson. He still keeps up professionally, but he spends a lot of his time now traveling. You can find him taking a jaunt to Europe, Vegas, and all over the world. I always say, sometimes I'll say, "Where's Ken?" And I'll be like, "I don't know. He was getting on a plane somewhere. Don't know." Ken is going to share some of his thoughts about hypothesis testing and information theory, or what many of us finally use now, AIC. Ken.
Does this thing work? It's a screen. It's just a matter of curiosity. There's that angle, I can't read that, but I don't really particularly need to. That's okay. Something that I don't know if you got the message from what Dr. Wilson said was, I started working with David in July of 1973 and continuously since then. So 45 years or so we were actually doing research and publication, quite a bit. I'm just going to focus on hypothesis testing, null hypothesis testing, p-values sort of thing, and model selection. They're interrelated. Before we got into AIC, before the society got into that stuff and more quantitative optimization, model selection, it was primarily based on ideas of null hypothesis testing. You'd have a simpler model as a null and a more complicated one, and you'd get a p-value. And should we stop here? Does this model not fit well to go on to the next one? And it was rather ad hoc, and there wasn't a clear idea of what you were going to get out of it. But model selection was important. Now, the first one up there, Otis et al., that was published in '78. That's where we really got hit with model selection. Because, again, if you go back to like 65 and 70, George, Sieber, and Jolly published a solution of the open model capture-recapture. And Sieber then 70 published it for the time-specific banding models analysis, but there was one model. There was just one model. Of course, the logical thing to do is they started generating more models. When you had one model, there was no model selection. And there was limited ability to fit these things with computers. Computers came along, more models, more fitting, and we ran into that. Notice it all. I think there was 8 or so models in there. They were fixed. You couldn't change them. You couldn't add a model. But nonetheless, you could put in your data, and then it became, well, which model do I use? You got to be careful. People say, well, I like the answer from that model. I'll choose it. That's not very good. Hard to defend. So we did something there. In retrospect, not great, but at least we did something. And not much more on the subject that I remember for several years. And then fortune hit, and David and I were at a Uring meeting, as it was called, in the Netherlands. And we'd already met Leberton. He'd actually come here and spent some time in Fort Collins. We were walking out the door to get our bus, and Leberton, a little before that, came up and said, you know, there's this program in the US and in France where you can apply for a modest amount of money for travel to get together, and Leberton and Claubert and David and I could get together and think about a general publication on capture, recapture sort of things. We did. We succeeded. Came up with this publication in 1992, which was very general. And they had the program Surge. And in Surge, you can build your own model. It's not set up with models fixed in there. So you can specify all sorts of models. So now you've got a way to analyze your data and fit all sorts of models. And as we were getting toward the end of this, well, it was probably a couple of years before it was published, we were sitting down. Actually, they were visiting us here in the unit and saying, God, you know, we got to give them some advice on model selection. If we're going to tell them you can fit this model, that model, another model, you can't just leave it to select the one you like. You got to have some criterion for doing this. And I remember we were chatting about this, and I thought, I remember when I was a student, somebody mentioned something called AIC. And so I went into my office, and oh yeah, it exists. And the bottom of that is we decided, the bottom line is, we decided, all right, we'll recommend that. We didn't know a lot about it then, but we knew enough that, well, it's in the literature. We could recommend it. It's easy to compute, and you can use that to select the model. And that started our interest in that. And since then, a little further down in all this stuff, those publications made use of AIC, and during which time we proceeded to read the literature on it. Reading a lot of literature on it, learning more about it. Both of us, David and I, we were running it, evaluating it. It became useful in the northern spotted owl stuff. And at some point, I don't remember when, David, who was fearless in jumping into things, I think we weren't really well versed in them yet, said, Burnham, let's write a book on AIC. Backed off, you know. I don't know anything about it yet. I don't understand it. I don't know how it's proved. I don't know. But we got started. And so while we were writing that thing, I was reading all the literature on it, reading what Akaike produced, reading everything I could, trying to understand it, figuring out how to derive it myself, how to prove it so I could see the steps and what was assumed. And those things were all done, and they were in the book, and I started feeling like I knew something about it. And sort of an aside here, at some point after that was published, a statistician had reviewed it, I guess. And he made the comment, I don't know where he got this comment, says, I don't think those guys ever read anything that Akaike wrote. Well, actually, I read everything he wrote, and I had paper copies of them. I have notes in all the margin, all over the place in it. Now, he was in England. I didn't have a chance to get with him, say, you SOB, I don't know where you got that. I read it all, a lot, and the comments all over the place, so I don't know what sparked that. So that book came out in '98, and we continued to work on it a lot, learn more and more. There was a lot to be known about it. You know, I was working on this stuff and would, on my own, realize that you had to normalize the AIC by subtracting the minimum. You get these deltas. and then find out that, well, Akaike knew that. And you go a little bit further and realize that you can define a likelihood of a model. Well, he did that. So I'm finding this stuff out. It's sinking into my brain, and then I'd find out that he had done that. And then you can define the relative importance of different models by a ratio of probabilities. And then you can modify those into these weights. So all of that stuff was sinking into us and realizing it had been done before. And so multi-model and all of that stuff. And so 4 years after the first one, we wrote the second one, which added a lot of material because we had learned a lot. And that one sort of made the 98 one out of date. In fact, a lot of the stuff in the 98 stuff, by the time it came out, was out of date because we'd write the first few parts of it with what we knew and later learn more in it. But we didn't go back and correct all that. So the one in 2002 came out, and that one's worth knowing about. I discount the 98 one now. Looking at the citation of these things before I came in, when I was writing this down, Google does not separate out the citation count for the 98 and the 2002 book, and I wish they did. I can't get them separated, but the total count the last time I looked was a little less than 64,000 citations on those two. Somebody's at least citing it. I don't know if they're reading it. I mentioned that to somebody, and she said, yeah, they're citing it, but they might not be reading it. I know. While we were doing that, a little after it came out in 2002, I think, we get an email. It was probably an email from an editor of a journal. It shows up there, Sociological Methods in Research. And he says, I'm preparing a special issue in this journal on model selection. Would you contribute something? Well, we had done a whole lot more stuff that wasn't even in those books. So I said, yeah, we'll do it. Okay. And wrote a lot about it. It ended up being like almost a 60-page paper. Sent it in to him. He freaks out almost. So he says, good God, this is too long. We can't put this in there. You asked for it. Put it in. And it showed up the way we wrote it, went in. There were 4 papers in there. One was sort of a general paper. It's been cited 94 times. There was another one that was very theoretical, very hard to read, and no use to anyone for applied stuff. It's been cited 64 times. Then there was one that wasn't quite so theoretical. It just had some useful stuff in it. It's been cited almost 1,000 times. Then the paper we put in there, and I hadn't paid much attention to this, and I started writing this, and I looked, thing's been cited almost 11,000 times, which is not bad. And we're back to this issue. I don't know if they actually read it or not. They're citing it, but it's nice that it's cited that way. I also mentioned that some of the stuff we wrote was, David thought it might be a little difficult for even biologists and ecologists to read. So he stripped out all the math and wrote a book himself, published in 2008. It's been cited 2,300 times. What was it like to work with David on us all these years? It was really great. He's a very good person to work with. He's a positive sort of person, makes useful comments on things, not negative. If he has critiques or anything, he leads more with a carrot than the stick. So on times I needed a little motivation, why he would give it in a positive manner, not telling me, Burnham, get your ass in gear and write this stuff you're supposed to write. It's really a joy to work with, and all this working with us was very satisfying. I don't know if I want to use the word fun on it a lot, but definitely very positive, very satisfying, very gratifying. David is a good leader, a very natural-born leader. I think he was just really a good leader. I enjoyed working with him. Now, this thing, we didn't switch over to the other page. Nobody told me how this thing works. The right side? Oh, I didn't even do that. Okay, good. That's good. Yes, that is this one. That's switched over. Is it Journal of Wildlife Management? Okay, that's skipped a page, but it doesn't matter. This skips over to null hypothesis testing. They're interrelated, as I said, and one reason to switch from something based on these ideas of testing to something like AIC is it changes the approach to an optimization problem. Much easier to deal with. Doesn't matter the order in which you do these models fittings. Whereas in things like stepwise and other stuff, it matters. So now it doesn't matter, and if you bring in a new one, fine, it doesn't change. You don't have to go back and refit anything. So it's much better than the null hypothesis testing approach. But in the meantime, we knew null hypothesis testing went on. The statistical literature and the profession has known for a long time all sorts of problems with p-values in testing. And I don't know when we got into writing this paper, it shows up there, but David did something that he does a lot, and he brought in somebody else to help us, so he doesn't carry the whole load. He will be instrumental in leading things and writing maybe the initial stuff, but add somebody else to do this. And that was Bill Thompson. And so we published that paper in 2000. It's not the only thing in the wildlife literature on it. Doug Johnson published something in 2002. There's other people on this. And so it became in the literature that this stuff was a problem. And then the Franklin et al. Thing published here, that interrelated a little bit and made the point, which we made other places, that information theory stuff and AIC and so on can replace null hypothesis testing for model selection. That's what that publication was about. Not everyone liked that. There's a statistician, well, he seems to have gone into hiding or not on the faculty anymore, at Oregon State Department of Statistics, who got it in his mind to publish a paper, see, it doesn't show here. Yeah, in an ecology forum, became an ecology forum. And the short title for the ecology forum was on p-values and model selection, and his paper, the lead paper, was in defense of p-values. Now, not many people were willing to do that. He published a paper in defense of p-values, and in part it's a critique of our work to some extent, and saying, you know, AIC, model selection, all that stuff, it's just another way of looking at the data. It's not doesn't add anything, get the same thing with testing. And so the editor wrote, when he changed it into a forum, he wrote us and says, you want to put a paper in there? Yes, we did. So we wrote this one in 2014. It was published. P-values are only an index to evidence. Now, I made a mistake there. That's wrong. P-values are not a legitimate index to evidence. I've figured out since then, evidence in these cases is a ratio of probabilities, an odds ratio. The likelihood ratio is an odds ratio. It is evidence in itself. You don't have to wipe it around with -2 log likelihood chi-squares and all of that stuff, but people don't tend to do that for some reason. Now, so I don't say we stuck our neck out, but we wrote that in 2014 without knowing that AIC, the American Statistical Association, was considering this issue, and they did something they had never done before. They put out, in essence, a policy paper about p-values and null hypothesis testing and said, you know, you really shouldn't be doing this stuff so much. And so they'd never before made an official statement that here's a methodology that really should back off on it. They didn't really go all the way and say what I would have liked them to say. That came out in 2016, the ASA statement on p-values, context, process, and purpose. So they were critiquing this paper in essence on defense of p-values. They were saying, you know, they're not really defendable. So that really made us feel good to see that come out. And I checked on this statistician who wrote this defense thing a few years after this. He wasn't on the faculty anymore. I don't know what happened there, but he was too young to just leave like that. So his department must have been a bit maybe embarrassed by him. I don't know. It was really, really fun to work with David on all this stuff. And of course, this is just a smidgen of what we did together. I'll point out that in the 40-some years we worked together, we published jointly. David and I were on there, possibly with other people, 96 publications. About half of everything I did. I don't know about him. I've never seen his CV. I don't know what all those other publications were. I know he did other work with other people using AIC, but I'm not sure what those are. Okay, I'm going to switch. Okay, not there yet. Back, please. Is this got? I guess something's up there. I'm on a page where it says, I made an analogy in my own mind to something in medicine. You know, may aware in the Middle Ages and for a long time, medical doctors thought, this person is sick, they got bad blood or something, bad spirits, and they would do bloodletting. At its peak, bloodletting was a phenomenon that was well regarded by the medical community as a viable treatment strategy for almost any disease process. It was not a throwaway treatment given individuals of reduced means, but rather a pervasive treatment strategy recommended to rich and poor alike. And I always, after a while, got to thinking, this p-value stuff I'm concerned is like the bloodletting and the medicine. It's become the statistician's equivalent to that. They can't kill them. They want to do this. And there are better things you can do. I wish in the future could say that p-values were once a phenomenon that was well regarded by the statistical community as a viable data analysis strategy for almost any data, and no longer is. It's basically the things you can do that are more informative supplanted. They're better. Okay, the one picture, please, of David. Is that going to go? Yes. Now, they put them on the same page. That's okay. I put this there because I thought I had put a picture in. I like this. It was taken May 20, 2000 at Patuxent, a wonderful place to work. And David hated the bureaucracy and stupidity of it. And the bureaucracy in its brilliance changed the name of Patuxent. This is a well-recognized name. And they changed it. Oh, that was stupid. This was taken in Bill Kendall's office, who joined us. Now, that last one, since we are in a ecology, wildlife, fisheries, conservation biology situation, we ought to acknowledge that there's wildlife out there that's interesting to go and look at. Now, how many people know what this thing is up there? I took that picture at the Kariga Game Reserve in South Africa, one of my various travels that Ken referred to, and I did quite a bit. And our guide, you can't walk around here, our guide said, those things aren't usually out at this time of day. I was lucky to get a picture of it. Weird animal. Hopefully some people in here know what it is, but I'd be interested if some of you don't know what that is. It's an aardvark. A weird animal. It ignored us. It was going around the termite mounds, scratching them. I don't think they have any teeth. They got claws on them you wouldn't believe, and they can take these almost cement-like termite mounds and just rip them to shreds and get those things. So I enjoyed watching it. Do I have any? No. That's the extent of my comments for now.
We've got some time. Any questions for Ken?
I would like to, I said some of this, but I'd like to emphasize before the extent to which David was really a leader, a really good leader. He could organize things and get things done. It always sort of amazed me that how he managed to do that. He was very talented at that, and at lecturing, and at research, and helping other people research and helping students. So as an extraordinary person.
I have a question for you. So many of you probably know that in his PhD and all that early capture recapture work, Ken developed the Jackknife Estimator to estimate abundance when there's heterogeneity. And my master's was simulating all those stupid models in Otis et al. And what you ended up finding, and you'll see that in the literature, if you're stuck, use the jackknife. I'm curious how you even thought of coming up with that. What was your reason?
My major professor. My major professor said, Burnham, why don't you look and see if you can use the jackknife and develop an estimator of population size? So,
Followed orders.
I did accept the way that I had to generalize it. The jackknife was sort of a one-step thing for bias reduction. You needed to go several steps on it. And the one in the literature that had extended it was, I didn't like the way they did it. So I did it a different way. I developed it in a different manner, easier to understand for me. And so then I used that. And my major professor looked to see what I had done on that and said, I like that a lot better than what they did. So it was original enough that that part got into the thesis on K, plus the application of it.
Right, yeah. Any other questions? No, thanks, Ken.
Thank you.
Yeah. You know, when I think about that early work that led to other work, well, and there was work before that, and the complicated models and the model selection and choosing this, it made me think back to one of my early graduate students, Miles Falk, who works for the Greater Lakes Indian Coalition up in Michigan. And in Miles' exit seminar, he made the comment, he was trying to choose between Montana State and CSU. And he said, you know, had I gone to Montana State, I'd have been done a lot earlier with my degree. And it's true. You know, who needs this model selection? You just pick one. You know, you're done. I think all those citations for all the AIC stuff was probably that reviewer from England.